I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we react to news that the general in charge of Russia's nuclear and chemical weapons division has been assassinated in a scooter bomb attack in Moscow. Hear live from the Joint Expeditionary Force summit in Estonia, and later, hear our next dispatch from the frontline city of Kharkiv.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of Nato and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 17th of December. 2 years and 303 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, live in Tallinn, and former tank commander and chemical weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. First, though, over to Dom for our lead story and military developments.
Well, hi, Francis, and hello, everybody. So let's start in Moscow. So the senior Russian general in charge of the country's nuclear and chemical weapons division was killed this morning in a scooter bomb attack. This is Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov. He was killed along with his assistant when the bomb was detonated remotely as they left an apartment building a few miles southeast of the Kremlin. The Security Service of Ukraine has taken responsibility for the assassination. That is according to a Ukrainian security source quoted by both Reuters and the AFP news agency. The source said Kirillov was a war criminal and an absolutely legitimate target as he gave orders to use banned chemical weapons against the Ukrainian military. Now, Lieutenant General Kirillov had been sanctioned by the United Kingdom over the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine. He's believed to be the most senior Russian officer assassinated since the start of the full-scale invasion. Photographs posted on Russian Telegram channels showed a shattered entrance to a building littered with rubble, two bodies lying in the blood-stained snow. A partially destroyed electric bike was visible among the wreckage. There is now a video out there purporting to show this attack. A criminal case has been opened in Russia. Confirming the attack, the Russian Investigative Committee said an explosive device planted in a scooter parked near the entrance of a residential building was activated on the morning of December 17th on Ryazanskaya Avenue in Moscow. Igor Kirillov, the head of the Radiation, Chemical and Biological Protection Forces of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, and his assistant were killed. It called the incident a terrorist attack. Now, Russian state news agencies reported the device had an explosive force equivalent to 300 grams of TNT. I guess they're just going on the images of the blast. Several cars on the first 4 floors of the apartment building were damaged. Now, Russia's radioactive, chemical and biological defense troops, they're a separate branch of the military. They prepare troops for radioactive and biological contamination. Their motto is, "After us, there is nobody." But it sounds like somebody was after you, lads. Anyway, Ukrainian prosecutors charged Lieutenant General Kirillov in absentia just yesterday with the alleged use of banned chemical weapons in Ukraine. That comes from the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine. These are accusations Russia denies, of course. Now, the SBU claimed that Russia used chemical weapons nearly 5,000 times under Kirillov's leadership, and Britain, as they sanctioned him in October over the reported use of riot control agents and the choking agent chlorpicrin on the battlefield. We're going to hear more from Hamish shortly about chlorpicrin. He's spoken of it many, many times. It's an oily substance, particularly widely used in the trenches of the First World War. Causes extreme irritation to the eyes, skin blistering, and can induce vomiting, diarrhea, and potentially fatal accumulation of fluid in the lungs. It's banned under the 1997 Chemical Weapons Convention, which Russia has signed. Now, I'll leave the wider analysis to Hamish in a moment, but I'll just draw the analogy with the car bombs of the 1970s and the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices of my generation in Iraq and Afghanistan. IEDs were said to be the car bombs of the modern era. The thing about a car bomb is that they could be anywhere. And it's one thing to have a device under your car, as we saw in that attack last week in the occupied territories and indeed in recent months. But, you know, an individual can check his or her car for the lump. But car bombs or bombs as part of scooters or other devices are entirely different. And just imagine today, right now, any Russian official walking along a street will be looking at everything, cars, scooters, motorbikes, wondering if that's the next thing that's going to explode. And that's the point of these things. They are not only used as a direct attack method, but they also mess with the minds of everybody else. That's what IEDs were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a very interesting mode of attack. Elsewhere, Russian attacks across Ukraine yesterday killed 4 people in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk cities and in Kherson Oblast, injured others. Chernihiv, Luhansk, Sumy and Zaporizhia Oblast also came under attack, but no casualties reported there. On the ground, Russia has advanced slightly to the southwest of Pokrovsk and in the northwest of the territory Ukraine holds in Kursk by a few hundred metres in there. A couple more for me, Francis. Ukrainian Defence Minister Rustam Umerov has ordered an investigation into the alleged abuse, extortion and humiliation of soldiers in the 211th Pontoon Bridge Brigade by their commanders. The announcement comes after Ukrainska Pravda reported that the unit's officers have beaten and mistreated soldiers and extorted money from them. Mr. Umerov ordered the Defence Ministry to investigate the papers or Ukrainska Pravda's revelations, saying such behaviour would be, quote, unacceptable in the third year of the war. Unacceptable in any year of the war, mate. He said, my position as a minister is clear. All those responsible must be punished. Now, Colonel Ole Pobrežniuk, the brigade commander, has been suspended as the investigation goes on. And finally, for me, I'll just draw your attention to today's British Ministry of Defence tweet, which highlights Russia's equipment losses. They say Russia has lost over 3,600 main battle tanks and over 8,000 other armoured vehicles since the start of the full-scale invasion. They say that has led to a reliance on outdated and poorly maintained former Soviet equipment previously held at strategic storage bases. On the tweet today, they show a kind of them and now imagery from bases at Arseniev, Brai and Ulan-Ude, showing a very striking reduction in the number of vehicles. So we've reported that before. It's interesting to see visual imagery, visual evidence showing it. I would link it to an article in Foreign Policy magazine that's titled Russia's War Economy is Hitting Its Limits. This was by Mark Devore, a senior lecturer at the University of St Andrews, and Alexander Mertens, a professor of finance at the National University of Kyiv. Phillips O'Brien, in his recent newsletter, highlighted this article, so we'll put a link in today's episode notes, but I would go and have a look at it if you can. The authors say, perhaps foremost among Russia's arms bottlenecks is its inability to replace large caliber cannons. They cite open source researchers saying that Russia has been losing more than 100 tanks and around 220 artillery pieces on average every month. And to produce tank and artillery barrels requires rotary forges, which they say are massive pieces of engineering, each weighing about 30 tons. And they can only produce 10 barrels a month. Russia has 2 of these forges. So in other words, they're saying Russia is losing around 320 tank and artillery cannon barrels a month and producing only 20. Another point they make, they say open source researchers have counted the loss of almost 5,000 infantry fighting vehicle since the start of the war, which comes out to an average of 155 a month. Now, Russian defence contractors can produce about 200 a year or 17 a month. So they say, we do not know when Russia will hit the end of the road with each equipment type, but there is little the Kremlin can do to stave off that day. Russia's leaders face an unenviable set of dilemmas entirely of their own making. Russia cannot continue waging the current war beyond late 2025, when it will begin running out of key weapons systems. So I just mentioned that because it shows some of the undercurrents going on with the war more broadly. We talk about Russia taking a few hundred meters of ground every day or what have you, and that's not ideal. But if you look at the underlying currents going on in this industrial attritional war, there are some very, very stark reminders here that Russia is, in the long term, and Ukraine have to stay there for the long term, but Russia is going to struggle in the next few months to produce enough kit. That's why they're getting all this stuff from Iran, North Korea and elsewhere. But a very interesting article there in Foreign Policy, and we'll put the link into today's episode notes. And that's us up to date.
Well, thanks, Dom. Let's go back then to that lead story of the assassination of the Russian general in Moscow. Hey, Mr. Bretton-Gordon, this is a subject, of course, you'll be very familiar with given your background. Where do you want to start?
Francis.
Well, thanks very much for having me. And quite a thing to wake up to this morning. One of my very good contacts describing Kirillov as a real scumbag, but a very important scumbag at that. I think not only for his chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear background, but also as a spokesman. He's one of Putin's very, very close aides and puts out a lot of propaganda, which I'll come on to. But just to give you a bit of a flavour for this guy and what his background is. Now, both he and I ineffectively did or do the same jobs. I did the same job for NATO in the UK, but my role was very much defensive, defending against chemical and radiological and nuclear attacks, whereas Kirillov is very much offensive. This is a key part of the Russian offensive capability. And I'll come on to Ukraine and why it's so important at the moment. But just a bit of background. He took up his role in 2017. 2018, people remember, in fact, March 4th, 2018, there was a certain Novichok attack in Salisbury, where I'm speaking to you from now. Now, that Novichok would have been provided and probably authorized by Kirillov, and the GRU agents who conducted the attack would have been trained by his people. And at the time, he was putting out a lot of disinformation and propaganda on the channels in Russia, saying that actually it was British secret agents who were responsible for the Novichok attack. We then wind forward into Syria. And as I've discussed on this pod a little bit, and certainly written in the paper about it quite a lot, the extensive use of chemical weapons in Syria. Remember another Russian general we used to talk about a lot, Surovikin, who really designed the Russian playbook based on his experiences in Syria. But also part of that playbook in Syria involved the extensive use of chemical weapons. And with the fall of Assad, I think I spoke last week about securing those chemical weapons sites and the remainder of Assad's chemical weapons. But Kirillov saw how effective the chemical weapons were there, and even using basic toxic industrial chemicals like chlorine. Bizarrely, he was also involved in COVID. Some people might remember the Russians deployed his unit, his CBRN unit, to Italy at the beginning of the COVID campaign to help the Italians out there. But with his activities in Ukraine, and as Dom has said yesterday, the Ukraine government indicted him for 5,000 uses of chemical weapons on the front line in Ukraine. Certainly some of the investigations I've done and another Telegraph regular, Jimmy Rushton, has done over the last 12 months would suggest that those numbers are probably pretty near the mark. And when we talk about the advances, as Don was just then, that Russia has been having, actually, an awful lot of the advances have been enabled by the use of chemical weapons. Chloropicrin is the main weapon they're using. This was one of the first weapons developed in the First World War, a choking agent, very unpleasant. CS gas, British soldiers would know it as, or riot control agents that we see used across Europe, but really unpleasant, but very effective. Their use on the front line, which have enabled Russia to actually make advances, because one of the key issues is the force protection measures against chloropicrin is basically just a gas mask. But unfortunately, the Ukrainians don't have those in great supply at the moment. So it's a sort of easy fix. His unit is termed as Special Forces in Russian parlance, but they are really nasty tricks organisation. Although there's a nuclear in there, it'd be confusing to suggest that Kirillov has one hand on Putin's nuclear button. That is not my understanding. He's very much on the chemical side, the biological side, and maybe the radiological side. And only recently he accused Ukraine of developing dirty bombs, radiological bombs, as it were. So a hugely important figure, very, very close to Putin, one of his key aides. And I think with the Syria debacle, as far as Russia's concerned in the last 2 weeks, with Russia pretty unceremoniously being booted out of Syria, now Putin's right-hand man, who's had such an effect in the last 12 months on the battlefield in Ukraine been eliminated, for want of a better word, I think this is a really severe blow, but a really, really nasty character who's been responsible for some pretty horrendous acts and deaths. And I don't suppose anybody outside Moscow or outside Russia will be mourning his passing.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish, for that overview of a thoroughly unsavoury fellow, I think it's fair to say. But James Rothwell, thank you for your time as well today. Coming to you next, you're currently in Estonia. What are you up to?
Thank you, Francis. That's right. And great to be back on the podcast. I'm at the JEF Summit in Tallinn, Estonia. This is a UK-led rapid response force consisting of Britain, Baltic states and Nordic states, which complements NATO presence already in the Baltic region. The summit, which took place today, was largely an opportunity to discuss the possibility of raising NATO member states, particularly Baltic member states, spending on defence in terms of GDP. What has mainly been on the agenda today is the possibility of increasing defence spending per GDP among these member countries. So that's Britain, the Baltic states and the Nordic states. And Estonian ministers, both yesterday and today, have been saying that 2% of GDP on defence per year is not enough. They want to see that number coming up across the board. And in an ideal world, they would like to see these Western allies spending 3% at least of GDP on defence. Another big theme of the summit was inevitably the possibility of Ukraine perhaps joining NATO, something that the Estonians, a very strong ally of Ukraine, would like to see happen. The problem, of course, is that we know the mood on that issue in the United States is very, very different. We don't have the full details yet of what a Trump Ukraine peace plan might look like, but we do know that J.D. Vance, the vice president-elect, and others in Mr. Trump's orbit have basically ruled out NATO membership. Nevertheless, hope was expressed this summit that might be part of the solution to Ukraine. Indeed, I'd go further than that. The Estonian foreign minister, when I interviewed him earlier, was saying that it is basically imperative that Ukraine is allowed to join NATO. They view that as absolutely the best and most effective security guarantee for Kyiv. And then finally, Francis, the other thing that came up was a new initiative that was announced at the JEF summit today to crack down further on the Russian shadow fleet. As you know, this is a gaggle of rickety tin can vessels which are transporting gas and other supplies, evading sanctions back towards Russia. Not just a concern for Western leaders in terms of sanctions evasion, but also because it poses an environmental risk, the possibility that there could be a spill, which could then immediately flow into British or Scandinavian waters. And that was that decision to introduce further checks of those vessels, and I believe it's inspections of insurance documents, which are going to be happening not just in the Baltic region, but also in the English Channel. That announcement was welcomed by President Volodymyr Zelensky, who also did a brief address to the summit. But as you know, Francis, I've been roving around Estonia as well. I've been over at the border with Russia. I've been to a railway project that's under construction, which is potentially going to play a crucial role in any future conflict with Russia. So I'd be happy to speak a little bit about that as well if you've got time.
Absolutely. Go ahead, James.
Yes. So let's begin on the Estonian border with Russia. Me and a group of about 15 journalists were loaded onto a bus very, very, very early in the morning on Sunday, and we drove for about 2.5 hours through the stunning but absolutely freezing snow-covered Estonian countryside, and we got right to the border with Russia, the outer edges, if you like, of NATO's territory. And the bus stopped in a town called Narva, which is a very interesting place because it's in Estonia, but the overwhelming majority of the residents there speak Russian, and indeed many of them hold, if you like, Russian values or Russian cultural values. A good number of them are basically supporters of the Putin regime. Across the river from that town of Narva, you've got the Russian border, and you've got a Russian town on the other side as well. And the reason we went over there was to see what the situation is like on the border. There have been some incidents, some provocations, if you like, over the past year. There was the issue in Narva itself over the summer where Russian coast guards in the dead of night came and removed some river buoys from the river, which were demarcating the border. That looked quite ominous at the time because there was a whiff of trying to unilaterally change borders, which would be very alarming for Estonia, an EU and NATO member state, for reasons that are probably self-evident. But border police there told us that they'd actually seen all kinds of provocations and incidents and security-related issues at that border over the past year. I was told that about 2 years ago they recorded roughly a dozen incidents around the border, and that's gone up to 96 this year, so a big increase. And we're not just talking about this incident with the river boys, but we're also talking about irregular migrants being pushed by Moscow across that border in different places. We are talking about weird demonstrations, staged demonstrations that are taking place by the border of patriotic Russians basically saying, isn't it terrible that these lovely Russians who live over on the Estonian side are stuck over there? Perhaps we should, all be united. That kind of atmosphere. Putin himself has implied, indeed, that Narva should be returned to Russia at some point in the future. And most bizarrely of all, Francis, a border guard told me, and I'll end on this anecdote in terms of the Narva reporting, told me that over the summer they were out on patrol and they saw a blimp, like a Zeppelin, circling the skies rather ominously. They weren't quite sure what to do about it. It was on the Russian side of the border, but close to Narva. They suspected it was a provocation, so they decided to just leave it alone. The next day, the same Zeppelin came back, and this time the Russians had painted a Z on the side of it. And by that point, of course, they had no doubt whatsoever that its main purpose, perhaps in addition to surveillance, was to basically intimidate and perhaps even terrorize the Estonian population on the NATO side of the border. So it was a fascinating trip. We got a real insight into this kind of very unusual outer edge of NATO territory where you've got Russian-speaking, pro-Russian people living on the Estonian side of the border. And it was absolutely fascinating. And you can read that dispatch, of course, on the Telegraph's website.
Thanks, James. Well, we'll have a link in the show notes to that story. But just one final question to you, if I may. Can you tell us a little bit more about the response of the mayor of Narva to these latest actions?
Yes, so there was a big row earlier this year during the May victory celebrations. And what happens, just to briefly sum up the situation, is that on the day that's celebrating Russia's Soviet victory over the Nazis, there's a big patriotic display on the Russian side of the border, but all the TV screens are turned around and pointed towards Estonia. The intended audience is the Russian-speaking population inside Estonia. And the director of a museum in Narva, who is very much a supporter of Ukraine, decided that she wanted to respond to this rather provocative Russian nationalist display. So she hung a poster on the wall of the museum in Narva, which looks over the Russian border, which said Putin is a war criminal. And this caused a massive stink. Politicians in Narva itself, who certainly appear to have, shall we say, pro-Moscow sympathies, were outraged by this, and they've actually been trying to get the director of this museum removed from her post, she told us at the time. And I think that speaks to the tension on that border, Francis. You've got the Russians on the Russian side of the border blaring out patriotic nationalist music and Putin speeches on that Soviet victory day. But then on the Estonian side, even though most of the people who live there are Russian speakers and perhaps Putin supporters, there are some pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine Estonians there as well who could not leave that gesture unanswered, and that's why they put the Putin as a war criminal poster up on the wall of their museum.
Well, thank you very much, James, for your insights there. I have to say, a nice December trip to Estonia. It feels very festive. I'm quite jealous. But let's go to just the final political updates before we get to our dispatch from Kharkiv. Yesterday was a Russian Ministry of Defence board meeting with the Defence Minister Sergei Belousov reaffirming Putin's objectives in Ukraine, which he asserted remain a key precondition for any negotiated settlement to the conflict. That is widely understood to mean, as we've talked about many times, the handing over of vast swathes of territory and effectively putting millions of people under Russian control in places that the Russians have not even reached in Ukraine. Now, he also spoke about the Russian military's efforts to modernise its forces. He highlighted significant investments in cutting-edge tech, including AI, though they're obviously one man down after that senior chap got assassinated last week, as well as robotics and quantum computing. He also addressed what appeared to be mounting concerns within the military about logistics and supply chains. He emphasised there had been practically no disruptions in 2024, a point seemingly raised to reassure experts. He also revealed that the MOD regularly meets with military correspondents to discuss the challenges faced by the armed forces, with those issues being relayed to higher command. But as the ISW points out, the juxtaposition of those 2 points, reaffirming on the one hand the effectiveness of military logistics while simultaneously acknowledging the need for feedback, suggests underlying anxieties within Russia's defence establishment. Now, in a further effort to consolidate power and streamline Russia's military apparatus, Belousov confirmed Putin had ordered the establishment of the Unmanned Systems Forces. This new unit is intended to centralise control over Russia's irregular drone forces, a move that signals an ongoing push to harness the emerging tech in this war. He also boasted about the military recruitment successes. He said there have been over 427,000 volunteers signed up in 2024, averaging more than 1,200 recruits per day. Now, interestingly, that figure would mean that they are about 300 more soldiers, or losing 300 more soldiers per day than they are recruiting, if the estimates by the United States and the UK MOD are correct. Just as a reminder, back in October, Lloyd Austin said that there had been 1,200 casualties per day for the Russians, and the UK MOD said last month that Russia had suffered its highest casualty day since the war's outset, with daily losses climbing to an average of 1,523. So, as I say, if that figure is accurate, and it may not be because it may itself be propaganda put out by Moscow, then even then it's behind the figures that Western governments are saying are likely to be the losses Moscow is suffering. Now, meanwhile, on the geopolitical front, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, our old friend, has stated that Moscow has made no final decisions regarding its military presence in Syria. That word decision suggests that they have a choice. But he has confirmed that Russia is in active discussions with the various factions controlling the country. So watch this space on that. And just since we mentioned Syria, one final point to end on is we have supposedly, it's not 100% certain, but it's been posted by the presidential account, supposedly heard from President Assad. He said he never intended to flee to Russia during the collapse of Damascus. He said that he sought refuge at a Russian military base to oversee operations, only to find that his forces had abandoned key positions. Under increasing pressure from drone strikes, he says, he then had to undergo an airlift to Moscow as a necessity, not a voluntary departure. At no point during this event did I consider stepping down or seeking refuge, he said. Though he then goes on to admit that Syria had effectively fallen into the hands of terrorists and that it had underscored the dire situation. He also said that his time in the Russian base had felt like he was a breathing corpse. I would add, well, at least he was breathing, unlike the hundreds of thousands of victims of his regime, which slaughtered so many in the most horrific ways imaginable, including via chemical weapons, as Hamish spoke about earlier on. But that's where we are with all of the updates today. Next, let's go to our dispatch from Kharkiv. During our visit to the frontline city of Kharkiv in November, we followed the work of the aid organisation Humanity and Inclusion, one of the charities the Telegraph is supporting in this year's Christmas appeal, in David's memory. In today's special dispatch, we travel underground, where teachers and children are trying to do the most normal of things, go to school, in circumstances that are anything but normal. We start in what looks like, from the outside, a normal metro station in Kharkiv. So we've just walked underground. We're entering this huge cavernous space, going down the steps towards the metro platforms, and it seems to double the size of what you might expect to see in London. It's pretty busy, and there's no air raids at the moment, so it's just life going on as normal. So there are people leaving the trains and they're walking past lots of the shops. You can see people selling fashion, food, rolls, just what you'd expect in a normal metro station. Although I have to say, the posters here, though, they're not commercial, they're recruitment posters. And that recruitment poster is for the Kraken unit, which was one of the units that was involved in the battles around here and making sure that Kharkiv remained safe. Something you notice that you don't see on usual underground trains is armed soldiers at the entrance to a lot of the carriages. It's those little gestures, those little things that make you notice that this really is a frontline city. And we've just turned another corner. We're entering a makeshift school. It's as simple as that. We can see lots of individual classrooms and there are secure barriers, but the barriers have been repurposed so that they are no longer being used for ticket stamping or the equivalent of Oyster cards on the underground. And as we're walking along here, you can see lots of classrooms. There are students meeting and having what you'd expect in a normal classroom, and yet we are very deep underground. It's quite a remarkable sight. You really see, if I had to summarise it in a single word, it would be resilience. When you think of a metro station, you think grey, and there are a lot of grey concrete walls, quite low ceilings, but on those walls are bright colours, children's displays. There's one that is a map of Ukraine, but it's made of flowers. And there's a little play area where everybody's got their little drawers, their little trays, teddy bears, and it's just a sort of nice little quiet play area. But on the ground, you've got the ordinary play mat, and then underneath that, the solid, cold, concrete floor of the metro. Emerging from one of their lessons this morning are 3 children, 7 or 8 years old. Most lessons here are pretty normal: writing, reading, arithmetic. But some of today's classes, organised by Humanity and Inclusion, are very different. Hello.
Привіт. Його звати Франсіс.
Very nice to meet you. Did you enjoy the lesson?
Сподобалось слухати, да?
Так.
Інформацію.
Yes.
What did you like about it?
Що от вам найбільше сподобалось? Що тобі?
Пламіни. Все, пламіни.
Everything about mines. А тобі що найбільше сподобалось?
Landmines. These little children have had to learn what to do if they stray into a minefield. Did you know what number to call in an emergency?
А номери знали, куди дзвонить? Номери.
Так.
They knew about these numbers,
What is the
yes.
number?
101.
101, right?
112.
112 and 101, yes. Молодці. Good job.
Very good. Nearly 3 years into the full-scale invasion, for some younger children here in the metro station, this is the only experience of school they've ever known. I've come to speak to the teachers, the staff, and to some of the youngest Ukrainians about their experience of the war and their hopes for the future. First, though, I'm sitting in on that class. It's not just about landmines, but about all sorts of explosive ordnance and what to do in case of airstrikes and shelling. It's a surreal and haunting thing to watch. But for these children, it's as essential as learning to cross the road. The class is lively because the children have lots of their own stories to tell. One child remembers an explosion so close to his home that it blew the front door off. Another tells the class about the time a missile exploded nearby, destroying her father's car and shattering all the windows in their house. The teacher shows the children what to pack in an emergency backpack in case they have to flee. Clothes, batteries for a flashlight, food. But not crisps, says one little girl. They're too salty and they'll make us thirsty and we might need to save water. Well done, says the teacher. The children learn about checkpoints, about presenting documents to the Ukrainian soldiers, who throughout are described as our heroes. They learn about the skull and crossbones signs, which indicate danger, sometimes placed by emergency services and sometimes handmade by civilians. And they learn not to play in the wild verges by the side of the road or near trees that have been felled by bombs or in abandoned houses. This is where unexploded ordnance might be, often dark green in colour and intentionally made to be hard to spot. One little girl says she saw some teenagers playing in her old nursery, which had been damaged by bombing. They were silly, she says. They could have been hurt. Yes, you're right, says the teacher. Extraordinarily, the teacher tells the class this story. One character, a little girl, finds a teddy bear while playing hide and seek with her friends. She picks the teddy bear up, but it's booby-trapped with a small explosive, and she loses part of her arm. Don't pick up unfamiliar toys, says the teacher. This isn't far-fetched. A teddy bear bomb was discovered by UN investigators in Libya. The chief suspects? Russia's Wagner Group. Earlier this year, the UK's Ministry of Defence said the former Wagner mercenaries who'd worked in Libya were now operating in Kharkiv. These 7- and 8-year-olds already know more about war and war crimes than any child should. And even if the war stopped tomorrow, the children of Ukraine will need lessons like these for years, perhaps decades. Such is the volume of bombs and missiles Russia has dropped. And how old are you?
Скільки тобі років?
8.
8. Very good, very good. 8 years old. And how do you feel about learning in the school here? Do you like it?
Добре і зручно. Добре і зручно.
Подобається, да?
Так.
She said that it's not unusual for her to study in underground school.
Does she feel better being underground in a shelter?
Так, я почуваюсь у безпеці.
Yeah, I feel very safe here underground.
And how often does she hear sirens and explosions?
Кожен день.
Every day.
Every day. And what does she most enjoy studying here?
Я досліджую світ.
It's the subject called I Investigate the World.
Investigate the world.
І бути обережнішою з міною.
She said that during today's lesson she learned how to be more safe, more cautious.
And was there anything she particularly liked about the lesson?
Треба йти в укриття, коли звучить сирена.
I liked the most that when it is alarm on sound, I should go to the shelter.
Have you had a busy day today?
У тебе сьогодні багато справ, багато занять.
Одне танці.
Ага. Yeah, today she will also have a dancing class.
Dancing class?
Yeah.
Right, what kind of dancing?
Я ходжу на танці, гімнастику та контемпорарі. І все.
Yes, so I go to gymnastics and to contemporary dances.
Wow. What was before you were in the underground school? Where were you learning?
Це твоя перша школа, або ти ходила спочатку в іншу школу, а вже потім в цю, яка в метро знаходиться? This is my first school.
This is your first school. And do you feel safe here when there are air raid sirens?
Так, почуваю себе безпечно.
Yes, I feel safe here.
But what about in the city generally when you have to leave the school?
Небезпечно.
I feel not safe in the city.
And do your family have a shelter at home, or do you have to go to a shelter somewhere else?
Іноді тільки вдома остаюсь.
So yeah, in my house there is not a shelter. That's why I just stay inside inside the house.
Inside the house. It's very nice to meet you. What's your name and how old are you?
Мене звати Максим, мені 7 років.
My name is Maxim. I am 7 years old.
7 years old. How long does it feel that things have been strange in this city? Does it feel like a very, very long time, or does it feel recent?
Я відчуваю, що вона відбувається давно.
I feel that it took a lot of time.
A long time. A long time. Does he remember what it was like before the war? Do you remember what it was like before the war?
Поділися своїми впечатленнями, своїми враженнями. Як от тобі було до війни жити?
Мені було дуже гарно жити до війни.
My life before war was very good. I played with my friends a lot and everything was wonderful.
And now, of course, it is dangerous to play when there are air raids. How often do air raids happen? Once a day, twice a day?
Скільки ти? I think once a day.
Once a day. In the lesson, you got given a special wristband. Can you tell me what the wristband was and what it was for?
Там намальовано картинки, він відражає світ.
There are some signs, pictures on it, and it is light reflective.
The symbols on the wristband are signs, the sort of signs you might see on the street warning civilians about the dangers of falling buildings or nearby explosives. The wristbands are to help the children memorise signs and symbols to stay away from. The teacher, Natalia, was born in Kharkiv and has lived here all her life.
Despite difficult times, the city remains the most bright, the most beautiful city. And despite the challenges, difficulties, Kharkiv citizens try to continue living.
How long did it take for the school to be built, and how happy was she when it finally opened?
Thanks to the mayor for arranging this school very rapidly, for implementing this project very fast. When I was offered to work here, I was surprised, but I understood that there is maybe the only way to see kids, to talk with them, to interact. So I work here. Like it's my second year I working here, and we keep living, we keep studying, and it gives us possibility to communicate in person.
Коли ти постійно з дітьми спілкуєшся онлайн,
when it's, for example, if I compare with online, it's quite different thing. You, of course, you can see them, you can tell them something, but if we are offline, then I feel closer to them. We can build some connections. I can hug them a little bit. I can say them some supportive words if they need. I'm like their second mom, and here they are in the circle of their friends. I noticed that they are very open. They opened their souls, and here they feel safe. They feel surrounded by friends.
And of course, the session that we've just seen put on by Humanity and Inclusion is a good example of a face-to-face class that really helps the children. Can you talk about why you feel it is so important to have classes like this one?
Ну, це дуже актуально і дуже
We
важливо.
live in such an easy time, and we should keep safe not only during war, but it's not only mine safety rules, but also life safety, like fire safety rules, psychological safety. I think that they were partially aware of mine safety.
Okay.
Yeah?
Do we need to do anything, or can we just carry on?
No, we are already underground, so yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure. And if I could widen the discussion out, of course there is a lot of talk at the moment about the possibility of a ceasefire or negotiations. Is that something that you think is necessary here, or do you think that that is something that is dangerous? The Russian Federation is 30 kilometers away from here. Does she feel that peace can happen?
Okay, I will tell you my personal opinion, my thoughts. Unfortunately, yes, we have very bad neighbors, and from myself, I can say that I don't have trust to them, to their nation, and even if it will be any negotiations, I cannot believe them 100% that they will follow these negotiations, and it makes me feel worry very much.
And I think many people that we have spoken to would agree with your perspective. Returning to the subject of children, something that we have tried to cover as much as possible in our journalism is the subject of kidnapped children. Stories of children being taken away and taught to hate their own country at a very young age. How do those reports make you feel as a teacher?
I feel anger and pain when I read such news, and I always teach children to love other people and not to hate anyone, and that we should treat people as we would like to be treated. But with the war, it's another situation. It's very difficult. But in school, to children, we try not to talk about war. I would like them to be separated from it. It will be easier for them.
One day there will be peace. How do you feel about the next generation? How do you feel about the future of your country?
I am waiting for it so much. I'm waiting for peace to come very, very much. And I think that when peace will come, life will be even better in Ukraine than before. And we hope that our partners, our friends from other countries will help to rebuild Ukraine, to rebuild our city, and it will, our city will thrive.
And one final question. Many people listening to this will be in a position potentially to raise money for the class your children saw today. What would your message be to them about the importance of classes like that?
Despite a very difficult time, our life goes on, and children should feel safe. Education is the future. Children should learn, they should think about future, and I would like, if there is a possibility, to have more schools like this, to more classes like this. Yes, because education is essential.
Thank you very much. Дякую. And what would you like to be when you grow up?
Ким хочеш стати, коли виростеш?
Хочу стати дизайнером ландшафту.
I would like to be a landscape designer.
Landscape designer? Gosh. I will be sure when one day I'm able to afford a house, I will come to you to do my garden.
Okay, deal.
Deal. And what would you like to do when you grow up?
Я хотів би стати програмістом та гонщиком.
I would like to be IT programmer, and also I would like to be a racer, like car racer.
Car racer and the programmer. Wow. And I will keep an eye out looking for your name when I watch Formula One.
Дякую.
What would you like to do when you grow up?
Пока что не знаю, хочу пока что быть хорошим человеком, потом, когда подрасту, то посмотрю, стать.
Right now, I don't know. First of all, I would like to grow up being a good human, and then when I grow up, I will decide.
That's very wise. When I was growing up, I didn't know what I wanted to do either. So perhaps one day you will become a journalist.
Maybe.
Maybe. Thank you very much.
Дуже тобі дякую. Дуже дякую.
If you want to support Humanity and Inclusion, which works directly on the front lines with volunteers and those most vulnerable, please check out the show notes where you'll find a link to donate. There's also lots more information about the charity and their work. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.